Don't drink that." The words came in a whisper so soft that even a man who'd survived 3 gang wars barely heard them. "Don't drink that." Jim-Hoo's hand froze halfway to the crystal soju glass. His dark eyes shifted to find a 6-year-old black girl standing beside his table. Her white dress with its pink sash looked like innocence against his tattooed violence. Enormous brown eyes holding a warning that didn't belong on such a young face. The child had approached his private booth without his security intercepting her, which alone signaled something extraordinary about this moment. The restaurant hummed with the controlled energy of Koreatown's elite beneath warm amber lighting, the sizzle of premium galbi on tabletop grills filling the air with smoke and promise. Jim-Hoo had been discussing territory agreements with his lieutenants when this small interruption materialized. His security detail stood positioned at both entrances, somehow blind to her approach. Traditional Korean music played softly from hidden speakers, while servers in crisp uniforms circulated with bottles of premium soju and aged whiskey. The VIP section's rice paper screens created intimate alcoves, shielding conversations meant to remain private. Nia had been sitting in the back corner booth with her mother, her notebook open, while she practiced drawing the intricate patterns on the restaurant's ceramic plates. That's when she'd noticed the server, the one with the trembling hands. Her photographic memory cataloged every detail automatically. The way his fingers kept touching his jacket pocket, how his eyes darted between Jim-Hoo's table and the 3 men seated near the kitchen entrance, the unnatural stiffness in his shoulders as he prepared drinks at the service station. The 3 men troubled her more. They sat too still, their casual conversation at odds with the tension in their postures. Nia had learned to read people the way other children read picture books. Every microexpression, every involuntary gesture told a story. Her brain processed patterns others missed. The synchronized checking of watches, the way the tallest one nodded almost imperceptibly when the nervous server glanced their way, how their eyes tracked Jim-Hoo's every movement with predatory focus. She'd been watching the server prepare a special tray when her heart began to race. Something was wrong with the crystal soju bottle he handled, the one he'd pulled from his pocket rather than the bar. The way he'd glanced around before pouring, the slight tremor in his hands as he placed it on the tray destined for Jim-Hoo's table, the barely visible sigh of relief when he set it down and stepped back. The pattern completed in her mind like puzzle pieces clicking into place. Coordinated observation, nervous server, special bottle, repeated glances. Danger. Immediate and certain. The decision took 3 seconds of 6-year-old courage gathering itself into action. Nia closed her notebook, smoothed her white dress, and walked across the restaurant floor with purpose that adults would have questioned. She navigated between tables where business deals worth millions were negotiated in hushed Korean, her small form unremarkable enough that diners assumed she belonged to some family in a nearby booth. The security guards watched her pass, their trained eyes dismissing her as harmless, just a child wandering while her mother worked. They couldn't know that this little girl was about to save their boss's life. The path to Jim-Hoo felt longer than any she'd walked before. She reached his booth just as his tattooed hand, stories of violence inscribed in black ink across scarred knuckles, touched the crystal stem of the waiting soju glass. Nia leaned close, standing on tiptoes to reach his ear, and delivered her warning in a whisper that carried absolute conviction. Jim-Hoo didn't move, but the air around him curdled. He looked down at the small girl, her dark skin luminous against the starched white of her Sunday dress. "Why?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that usually made grown men tremble. Nia didn't tremble. She pointed a small, steady finger toward the server, who was now retreating toward the kitchen with unnatural haste. "He has a tell," she whispered, using a word she'd overheard from the card players in her neighborhood. "His left eye blinks fast when he looks at you, but it stays still when he looks at the men in the corner, and he touched his ear 3 times before he poured. People only do that when they're lying or scared." Jim-Hoo's gaze flicked to the corner booth Nia had indicated. 2 men in sharp, slate-gray suits sat there, their posture too rigid, their eyes fixed on the untouched glass of soju. Jim-Hoo made a microscopic gesture with his chin. Instantly, 2 of his guards intercepted the server, while 3 others moved like shadows toward the back of the restaurant. A man with a jagged scar across his knuckles appeared at Jim Hu's side, holding a small electronic device. He dipped a sterile strip into the soju. Within seconds, the device emitted a sharp, clinical beep. The liquid on the screen turned a bruised purple. "Arsenic derivative, boss," the man muttered, his face turning to stone. The restaurant, a temple of refined dining, fractured into chaos. The men in the corner booth tried to stand, but Jim Hu's soldiers were already upon them, their movements efficient and silent as they pinned the conspirators against the wood-paneled walls. "Nia." The scream came from the kitchen corridor. Keisha burst through the swinging doors, her apron stained with dishwater, her hair escaping its neat bun. She froze, her heart stopping at the sight of her 6-year-old daughter standing inches away from the most feared man in the city, surrounded by drawn weapons and restrained assassins. "I'm sorry, oh God, I'm so sorry," Keisha gasped, rushing forward to scoop Nia into her arms. She stood there, a lone black woman in a sea of dark suits and cold Korean steel, shielding her child with her own body. "She's just a child, she didn't mean to bother you." "She didn't bother me," Jim Hu interrupted. He stood up slowly, the ink on his neck shifting as he moved. He looked at the server being dragged away, then back at the little girl peering over her mother's shoulder. Nia wasn't crying. She was watching the guards hand signals, her mind already cataloging the way they secured the perimeter. "Your daughter just did what 5 of my best men failed to do," Jim Hu said, his dark eyes locking onto Keisha's panicked ones. She saw the world for what it actually is. The cool night air should have been a relief, but it felt thin and electric. As Keisha pulled Nia toward their rusted sedan, the girl's feet dragged. Her eyes weren't on their car. They were locked on the valet standing by Jim Hu's sleek black limousine. The young man was shivering, though not from the cold. Thick beads of sweat rolled down his temples, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets, twitching in a rhythmic, jagged motion. "Mommy, wait," Nia whispered, her voice tight. "The car man, he's shaking like the server." Keisha tried to pull her away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Nia, please, we have to go." But Nia had already turned. She saw Jim Hu stepping out of the restaurant's golden light, his silhouette framed by the ink-black suits of his men. The valet's eyes darted toward a heavy silver watch on his wrist, the same chunky industrial brand Nia had seen in the corner booth, and then to the underside of Jim Hu's car. "Don't touch it," Nia's voice rang out, high and piercing in the hollow parking garage. "He put something under the wheel. He's waiting for the watch to click." The reaction was instantaneous. Jim Hu's lead guard, a man built like a wall of granite, didn't hesitate. He tackled the boss to the concrete just as the valet bolted toward the exit. The rest of the security detail moved with terrifying, practiced, synchronized motion. One chased the valet into the darkness, while another, a wiry man with a pelican case, crawled toward the limousine. "Clear the area," the wiry man shouted. Keisha scooped Nia up and ran behind a concrete pillar, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Minutes felt like hours. The silence was broken only by the distant sound of a struggle near the fence and the soft, rhythmic clicking of tools against metal. Finally, the wiry man stood up, holding a magnetic block wired to a crude cellular trigger. "Secondary protocol, boss," the expert called out, his voice grim. "If the soju didn't get you, the ignition would have leveled the block." Jim Hu stood, brushing the dust from his suit with a terrifyingly calm precision. He didn't look at the disarmed bomb or the captured valet being dragged back by his throat. He looked at Nia. The girl was trembling now, her face tucked into her mother's neck. At 6 years old, she had seen the mechanics of a murder twice in 20 minutes. She understood the weight of the shadows in a way no child should, the burden of seeing the invisible threads that tied bad men together. Jim Hu approached them, his heavy boots echoing. Keisha stiffened, ready to fight, but the man stopped 5 feet away. He looked at Nia with a mixture of awe and something that resembled a haunting recognition. "You see everything, don't you, little one?" he asked softly. He wasn't looking at a witness anymore, he was looking at a miracle. The VIP room smelled of expensive cedar and the lingering ghost of charred oak. It was a space designed for silence and heavy decisions, far removed from the chaos of the parking lot. Jim, who sat behind a desk of polished obsidian, his tattooed hands folded with a stillness that was more intimidating than a raised fist. Across from him, Keisha sat on the edge of a velvet chair, Nia tucked into her side like a bird with a broken wing. "Tell me how she does it," Jim, who said, his eyes fixed on Nia, not with malice but with a profound, quiet curiosity. Keisha's grip on her daughter tightened. "She's always been like this, since she was 3. She doesn't just look at things, she records them. Every face, every license plate, the way people's eyes move when they're lying. She calls them glitches." "It's pattern recognition," Jim, who murmured, almost to himself. "A gift that makes men like me very wealthy or very dead." He leaned forward, his gaze shifting to Keisha. He had already seen her file, the 3 low-wage jobs, the cramped apartment in a zip code where sirens were the only lullaby, the mountain of debt from a system that didn't care for her survival. "You work 40 hours in my kitchen, 20 at the laundry, and 10 at the gas station," he stated, his voice devoid of pity. "And yet, you are still drowning." Keisha flinched, her pride flaring. "I do what I have to do for my daughter. We don't need charity." "This isn't charity. It is a debt," Jim, who corrected. He slid a thick, cream-colored folder across the desk. Inside was a prospectus for the St. Jude Academy, a school for the exceptionally gifted, where the tuition cost more than Keisha's neighborhood combined. "I have a scholarship fund for children of high potential. I want Nia in it. Full tuition, transportation, and a stipend for her mother so she can quit the laundry and the gas station." Keisha stared at the gold-embossed logo on the folder. The gap between her world and this room felt like a canyon. She saw the way his men looked at her, a black woman from the wrong part of town, and the way Jim, who looked at her daughter, like a prize to be claimed. "What do you want in return?" Keisha asked, her voice sharp with defensive skepticism. "Men like you don't give away golden tickets for free. What's the catch? You want to own her, use her." The air in the room grew cold. Jim, who stood up, the ink on his neck darkening as his muscles tensed. "In my culture, a life debt is not a transaction. It is a weight on the soul. Your daughter saved my life twice tonight. If I let her return to a life of poverty and danger when I have the power to change it, I am a man without honor." He looked Keisha directly in the eye, the power imbalance between them undeniable yet momentarily bridged by a strange, mutual respect. "I don't want to own her, Keisha. I want to see what a mind like hers can do when it isn't spent wondering if the door is locked." The office was a cathedral of glass and shadow, overlooking a city that Jim, who partially owned and partially haunted. He sat behind a desk of reclaimed timber, pushing a thick, leather-bound folder toward Keisha. Inside weren't bags of cash, but ironclad trust documents, tax IDs, and an accreditation certificate for the St. Jude Academy for Gifted Children. "I am not a man who believes in coincidences," Jim, who said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "I was an orphan in Busan, Keisha. I was raised by men who taught me that the world is a series of transactions and threats. I built an empire on blood and iron because that was the only language I was given." He gestured toward a wall of digital monitors displaying live feeds of upscale bistros, construction sites, and sprawling logistics warehouses. "These are my legitimate holdings. They provide for thousands of families. But the other side, the side your daughter saw tonight, is the price I pay for the power to keep them." Keisha looked from the monitors to the man. The tattoos on his hands weren't just art, they were a ledger of a violent life. "You're a criminal," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still humming in her veins. "You want to put my daughter in a school paid for by people you've hurt. I want to put her in a school where her mind is a weapon she chooses how to use, rather than a burden she carries in a kitchen," Jim, who countered. He leaned forward, the amber light catching the scars on his neck. "My philosophy is simple. Honor is the only currency that doesn't devalue. I owe a life debt. In my world, you protect the innocent who protect you. If Nia remains where she is, her gift will eventually see something she can't survive. At the academy, she will be shielded by my name and sharpened by the best minds in the country." Keisha stared at the scholarship papers. It was the escape hatch she had prayed for, but it felt like a golden cage. She couldn't just take his charity. She refused to be another name on a mobster's payroll. "I won't be a guest in your world," Keisha said, sliding the folder back slightly. "I'm a certified bookkeeper. Your legitimate businesses, the restaurants and real estate, they need someone who isn't afraid to look at the numbers. You fund her school, but I work for the tuition. I want a desk, a salary, and a contract. And Nia stays away from your other business. No meetings, no favors, no shadows." Jim Hoo's lips curled into the faintest shadow of a smile, not of mockery, but of respect. He saw the same steel in the mother that he had seen in the daughter. "Agreed," he said, extending a hand mapped with the history of his wars. "The boundaries are set. You manage the light, and I will keep the dark away from your door." Keisha reached out and took his hand. The contact was cold, firm, and felt like a pact with a beautiful, dangerous storm. 4 weeks later, the chaos of the restaurant kitchen felt like a distant, frantic dream. Nia was no longer coloring at a grease-stained prep table. She was at the St. Jude Academy, her photographic memory finally finding its match in advanced linguistics and logic puzzles. For the first time, the weight in her eyes had lifted, replaced by the bright, frantic energy of a child who finally understood her own magic. Keisha's new reality was framed in spreadsheets and high-rise glass. As the operations manager for Jim Hoo's legitimate holdings, she had spent a month untangling the messy ledgers of his restaurant empire. Their daily interactions had fallen into a rhythmic, charged cadence. Jim Hoo was a man of few words, but he listened to Keisha with a focused intensity that made her skin prickle. Between discussions of food costs and lease renewals, they traded pieces of themselves like rare coins. She taught him about the soul of the community that raised her, the resilience found in Sunday dinners, and the sharp edges of a world that never gave Black women a head start. In return, he shared the quiet gravity of Korean tradition, explaining the deep significance of jeong, the invisible bond of collective affection and loyalty. The attraction was a slow-burning fuse, but the reality of his world remained a constant chill. One afternoon, Keisha entered his private lounge to find the gentle benefactor replaced by the king of the underworld. Jim Hoo was standing over a subordinate who had skimmed from the accounts. He didn't scream, he simply leaned in, his voice a lethal whisper, and the air in the room seemed to freeze. Yet 10 minutes later, when Nia ran in from her school transport to show him a perfect score on her Mandarin exam, his face transformed. He knelt to her level, his tattooed hand carefully holding her paper as if it were a holy relic. The peace was shattered during a quarterly meeting with the syndicate's old guard. A group of senior lieutenants, men who viewed Jim Hoo's legitimate pivot with suspicion, sat around the boardroom table. One man, a scarred veteran named Sangblood, didn't bother to hide his disdain as Keisha presented the new audit. He interrupted her with a biting remark in Korean, his tone dripping with a specific, ugly prejudice. The table went silent. Keisha didn't need a translator to feel the heat of the slur. She felt the familiar, defensive armor of her pride beginning to lock into place. Jim Hoo didn't shout. He slowly set his fountain pen down. The sound hit the wood like a gavel. He spoke in a voice so cold it felt like a physical weight on the back of everyone's neck. "You are confused, Sangmin," Jim Hoo said, switching to English so there would be no ambiguity. "You think you are talking to an outsider. You are talking to my partner. To disrespect her is to tell me that you no longer value your tongue." The lieutenant's face drained of color. Jim Hoo stood up, his gaze sweeping the room, establishing a new, unshakable law. Keisha wasn't just an employee, she was protected by the shadow of the throne. The aftermath of the boardroom confrontation left a ringing silence in the hallways. As the old guard lieutenants filed out, their heads bowed in a mixture of fear and newfound caution, Keisha found herself alone with Jim Hoo in the dim light of the executive wing. The city lights outside blurred into streaks of gold and neon, reflecting off the glass like a fractured mosaic. Keisha's heart was still hammering against her ribs. She was used to fighting her own battles, used to the sharp, defensive posture required of a Black woman in spaces that didn't want her. But she had never had a man like Jim Hoo, a man of such terrifying power, step into the line of fire for her. "You didn't have to do that," she said, though her voice lacked its usual bite. She stood by the window, her silhouette slim and defiant. "I've dealt with men like Sang-min my whole life. I know how to handle a bigot." Jim, who crossed the room, his movements silent and predatory, yet he stopped a respectful distance away. "In my world, silence is permission," he said. "If I allowed him to speak to you that way, I would be unworthy of the loyalty I demand from others, and I would be unworthy of you." The air between them thickened, charged with the weight of things left unsaid for 4 weeks. Jim Hu looked at her, not as an employee, not as a mother, but as a woman who had somehow managed to breach the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. "This is dangerous, Jim," she whispered, using his name for the first time without the shield of a title. "Your world, my world. They aren't meant to touch. There are too many borders between us. Race, culture, the law, people will try to tear us apart just for the sport of it." "Then let them try," he replied. He stepped closer, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain clinging to his suit. He reached out, his tattooed thumb grazing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted the scars on his knuckles. "I have spent my life taking what I want, but with you, I find I only want to be given a chance." Keisha looked into his dark, guarded eyes and saw the vulnerability he hid from the rest of the world, a man seeking a redemption he didn't think he deserved. She didn't pull away. Instead, she closed the distance, her hand resting over the dragon inked onto his chest. When he kissed her, it wasn't the tentative start of a fairy tale. It was a pact. It was a collision of 2 separate worlds, a desperate, hungry claim laid against the odds. In that moment, the borders vanished, replaced by the heat of a connection that felt as inevitable as the tide. The transition from a secret pact to a public reality began with Nia. They sat her down in the quiet luxury of Jim Hu's garden, but before Keisha could find the delicate words to explain their changing bond, Nia simply looked up from her logic puzzle and smiled. "You finally noticed," she said, her eyes bright with that uncanny perceptiveness. To Nia, the logic of their connection was as clear as a mathematical proof. Jim Hu was the shield, and her mother was the heart. With her blessing, the walls between their lives began to crumble, though not without the friction of reality. The true test was Keisha's mother, Mrs. Evelyn. The first time Jim Hu entered her modest living room, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke. Evelyn sat across from the man whose neck was a canvas of violence, her eyes narrowed with a lifetime of skepticism toward men of power. Jim Hu, usually a man who commanded silence, found himself navigating the intricate social dance of a black family dinner. He learned that respect wasn't taken, it was earned through the patience of listening. He traded stories of Buson's docks for her stories of the Great Migration, finding a common thread in the struggle for dignity. Over time, Evelyn's disapproval softened into a wary, then genuine, acceptance as she watched him treat her daughter with a reverence she had never seen before. As their personal lives fused, their professional vision expanded. Keisha was officially promoted to operations manager of the entire legitimate division, but her ambition went beyond spreadsheets. She pushed Jim Hu to anchor his wealth in the soil that raised them. Together, they launched a cross-cultural community center project designed to bridge the gap between the Black and Korean neighborhoods. It wasn't just a building, it was a lifeline. Jim Hu began hearing former gang members for legitimate construction and hospitality roles, trading their street loyalty for a living wage and a second chance. He was learning to lead through hope rather than fear. 8 months bled into a new season of integration. The chosen family had become a solid, if unconventional, unit. At the center's grand opening, the image was striking. Korean elders and Black community leaders sharing tables, while Nia ran between them, translating more than just words. Jim Hu stood at the periphery, his hand resting comfortably on the small of Keisha's back. The syndicate brothers still watched from the shadows, and the neighborhood still whispered, but the bridges were built. The 2 families, once divided by invisible borders of history and suspicion, had begun to find a shared language in the spaces where their stories overlapped. The peace they had built over 8 months shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. It happened during the school pickup, in that golden hour when the St. Jude Academy was swarmed with luxury SUVs and laughing children. Keisha was waiting at the gate when the pattern broke. A black van, idling too long in a no-parking zone. Two men in utility uniforms whose boots were polished like soldiers. Nia saw it first. Her mind, now trained by the city's best tutors, didn't just see a van. She saw the lack of a company logo and the way the driver's eyes stayed fixed on the side mirror. She grabbed her lead security guard's hand, her voice a sharp, clinical whisper. "The van man is looking at my mom's shoes, and he's holding a radio under his clipboard." The guard didn't hesitate. He pulled Nia into a defensive crouch just as the van doors slid open. The attempt was surgical, meant to be a silent snatch and grab by a rival syndicate looking for leverage against Jim Hu. But Nia's warning gave the security detail the 3 seconds they needed to turn a kidnapping into a firefight. By the time Jim Hu arrived, the street was a graveyard of broken glass and spent casings. Keisha stood trembling behind a brick pillar, clutching Nia, her eyes wide as she watched Jim Hu descend from his car. He didn't look like the man who had brought her flowers the night before. He looked like a god of war. In the alleyway behind the school, Keisha witnessed the other side of the man she loved. Jim Hu didn't wait for the police. He found the one kidnapper who hadn't been killed and pinned him against the cold brick. There was no shouting, only the terrifyingly calm sound of Jim Hu's voice and the sickening crunch of a hand being methodically broken. He was a predator protecting his pride, his movements efficient, brutal, and devoid of mercy. Keisha watched from the shadows, her stomach churning. She saw the blood on his white shirt, a stark, jagged contrast to the man who tucked Nia into bed. This was the darkness she had feared, the reality of a man whose honor was written in violence. When he finally approached her, his breathing was shallow, his eyes still dark with the high of the hunt. He stopped, seeing the horror in her expression. He looked at his hands, then at her, and for the first time the Titan looked small. "I am what I am, Keisha," he said, his voice raw and heavy with a desperate honesty. "The world I built requires this monster, but I am trying. I am trying to be better for you, for her." Keisha looked at the blood on his cuff, then at Nia, who was watching them both with a quiet, knowing sadness. This was the duality of their life. The protector and the predator were the same man. She realized then that loving him wasn't about ignoring the shadow. It was about choosing to stand beside the light he was fighting to reach. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she wiped a smudge of red from his cheek. "Don't stop trying," she whispered. "Just don't ever stop trying." The original Korean barbecue restaurant looked exactly the same, yet everything had changed. The amber lighting still caught the swirl of wood grain on the tables, and the scent of sizzling galbi still hung thick in the air. But as Keisha walked through the front doors, the staff didn't see an invisible worker. They bowed, a deep, collective sign of respect for the woman who now orchestrated the empire's legitimate pulse. Jim Hu was waiting at the same corner table where Nia had first whispered a warning that saved a life. Beside him sat Nia, now 7, her hair intricately braided and adorned with small gold clips. She was laughing, showing Jim Hu a digital blueprint on her tablet, a design for the new community center they were opening in the heart of Keisha's old neighborhood. The dinner was a vibrant bridge between two worlds. Keisha's mother sat to Jim Hu's left, sharing stories of Keisha's childhood over bowls of japchae, while Jim Hu's oldest brothers from the syndicate sat across from them, dressed in sharp suits but wearing genuine smiles. The racial and cultural barriers hadn't vanished, but they had been outgrown by the strength of the family they had built. As the tea was served, the room grew quiet. Jim Hu stood, his presence commanding but no longer cold. He looked at Nia, then at Keisha. 9 months ago, a miracle walked up to this table and told me the truth, Jim Hu said, his voice steady. I have spent my life guarding secrets and building walls. I thought power was the ability to stand alone. I was wrong. Power is the courage to belong to someone. He reached into his jacket and produced a small wooden box. Inside sat a ring, not a flash of gaudy diamonds, but a delicate band of black gold set with a rare, deep green jade, symbolizing both his heritage and the new growth they had nurtured together. Keisha, you and Nia are my honor. You are my home. He didn't drop to one knee like a character in a Western movie. Instead, he bowed deeply, a traditional gesture of total devotion and soul-deep respect. Will you build this legacy with me as my wife? Keisha looked around the table, at her mother's tearful nod, at Nia's wide, expectant grin, and finally at the man who had traded his darkness for their light. She didn't see a crime boss or a predator. She saw the man who had fought to be better. Yes, she whispered, her voice carrying through the quiet restaurant. Always yes. The story comes to an end as Nia reached out, placing her small hand over theirs as they joined. She didn't need her extraordinary pattern recognition to see what was happening here. The lines had finally aligned. They weren't just a black family or a Korean syndicate. They were a chosen circle, a family defined not by blood or skin, but by the fierce, beautiful act of protection. If you love this story, hit the subscribe button to subscribe to this channel. And also tell us where you are watching from in the comments.